Imagine owning some of the most expensive land on earth and inheriting it through a 17th century marriage deal. This is the story of the Grosvenor family, how a single union turned marshes into Mayfair, and how that land became the foundation for a real estate empire worth over £10 billion. From secret trusts and primogeniture to global philanthropy and modern aristocratic dilemmas, the Grosvenors reveal how old money survives, adapts, and still quietly dominates cities today. Welcome to one of the most powerful families in Britain you've never really heard from, but whose influence you walk past in London every day. The story of how the Grosvenor family progressed from new money to old money is intertwined with centuries of land acquisition, strategic marriages, and a gradual ascent into Britain's highest echelons of wealth and nobility. Although their roots trace back to the Norman conquest of 1066, when Gilbert le Grosvenor followed William the Conqueror into England, the family's truly transformative leap occurred in the 17th century. It was then that Sir Thomas Grosvenor wed Mary Davies, an heiress to approximately 500 acres of largely undeveloped land west of London, known as the Ebury Estate. While at the time this land lay on the outskirts of London, it would soon become prime real estate as the city expanded. By the mid-18th century and into the 19th, the Grosvenors developed Mayfair and Belgravia, districts that evolved into some of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the world. According to sources cited in The Guardian and the BBC, these formerly marshy fields turned into elegant squares and residential terraces that attracted British aristocrats, foreign dignitaries, and wealthy merchants. The metamorphosis was so successful that Mayfair and Belgravia continued to command extraordinarily high property values, with reports from real estate market analyses, including Knight Frank and Savills, placing them among the most expensive locations on earth. This transformation of farmland into an ultra-elite address became the bedrock of the Grosvenor fortune, anchoring the family's transition from being mere landowners to influential city builders. Over the centuries, the Grosvenors leveraged their escalating wealth to reinforce their position within Britain's aristocratic framework. Eaton Hall in Cheshire, the family's ancestral seat since the 15th century, was repeatedly renovated to reflect growing prosperity and social standing. In the Victorian era, Eaton Hall was reimagined in a neo-Gothic style, symbolizing the family's elevated status. By the late 19th century, the estate hosted a series of lavish gatherings, drawing not just the local gentry, but also members of the extended royal family. Archival documents from the National Archives and contemporary newspaper accounts describe how Eaton Hall's opulent events solidified the Grosvenors' role as significant players in the upper echelons of British society, bridging the gap between the landed aristocracy and the rising financial elite. Although the Grosvenors' journey parallels that of other noble families, their ascent into old money is striking because of the sheer size and continued profitability of their urban landholdings. By the early 20th century, the family had established formal property management structures that would eventually evolve into today's Grosvenor Group, a global real estate powerhouse. The company now oversees developments and investments in more than 60 cities around the globe, from North America to Asia, thus broadening the family's influence far beyond the London squares that first established their renown. The official Grosvenor Group website emphasizes a commitment to long-term stewardship, sustainability, and urban revitalization, further cementing the family's reputation as stable, forward-thinking landowners, rather than speculative risk-takers. Despite this modern-day international presence, the Grosvenors retain traditional markers of aristocratic stature. In 2016, Hugh Grosvenor became the 7th Duke of Westminster upon the passing of his father, Gerald Grosvenor, inheriting an estate valued at £9 billion, according to the Sunday Times Rich List. By 2024, his estimated net worth rose to £10.127 billion, placing him among the wealthiest individuals in the United Kingdom. Multiple profiles of the Duke in the Telegraph and the Financial Times highlight his relative youth and low-key personal style, a departure from the more flamboyant archetype of high society aristocrats. Yet his close ties to the British royal family, particularly his role as a godfather to Prince George, illustrate the enduring social connections that define old money in Britain. Alongside wealth and prominence, the Grosvenors have cultivated a tradition of public service and philanthropy. The Westminster Foundation manages and channels significant charitable contributions, focusing on issues like mental health, education, community development, and social mobility. Official statements on the Westminster Foundation's website detail grants to local nonprofits and large-scale partnerships with global NGOs. These philanthropic efforts reinforce the family's image as responsible custodians of generational wealth, an image that is often contrasted with the new money approach of aggressively expanding portfolios without a philanthropic footprint. Journals like Charity Times and interviews cited in The Independent note that over recent decades, the foundation has supported projects in countries ranging from the United Kingdom to Africa, reflecting both local roots and an international perspective. Still, maintaining such a vast fortune and centuries-old aristocratic traditions inevitably invites scrutiny. The family's tax arrangements, in particular, have come under fire. Investigative pieces in The Guardian and The Times have discussed how complex trust structures allow the Grosvenors to pass down vast wealth with minimal inheritance taxes, legal under current UK statutes but often criticized by public figures, and advocacy groups who argue that it perpetuates inequality. Historical controversies also trail them. In the 19th century, whispers of scandal sometimes surrounded the family, with a few younger Grosvenors gaining reputations for high-stakes gambling or lavish personal spending. Although many accounts of these incidents derive from contemporary tabloids of the time, they nevertheless cemented a public perception that great fortune could breed both admiration and resentment. Modern-day public perception of the Grosvenors is further shaped by their comparatively low-key profile. While new money magnates might make headlines through social media revelations or celebrity events, the 7th Duke of Westminster and his relatives tend to avoid ostentatious displays. Public appearances are often tied to charity galas or official civic duties, and interviews remain infrequent. This reserved stance is a hallmark of old money, where longevity and discretion matter more than seeking publicity. As a result, critics and admirers alike note the paradox. The Grosvenors command a global real estate empire and possess extraordinary wealth, yet they remain largely out of the public eye. Tax-exempt trusts have long been central to how Britain's landed aristocracy manages inheritance and preserves wealth across generations. But the Grosvenor family's use of these legal structures has become a focal point in the modern debate over fairness and taxation. When Gerald Grosvenor, the 6th Duke of Westminster, died in 2016, his entire estate, valued at around £9 billion, passed to his son Hugh, now the 7th Duke, through a series of trusts. News outlets including The Guardian, The Times, and the Sunday Times pointed out that this arrangement allowed the new Duke to pay only a fraction of what would otherwise have been due under a standard 40% inheritance tax. According to estimates reported by The Guardian, The family's trust-based system may have saved around £3.4 billion in taxes. Legally, these trusts incur a periodic 6% charge every 10 years, a substantially lower liability than a one-off 40% levy upon death. Critics on social media platforms such as X, formerly Twitter, as well as in mainstream outlets like The Independent and The Guardian, argue that this represents how Britain's aristocracy still enjoys disproportionate privilege, despite the country's stated commitment to meritocratic principles. Organizations such as Tax Justice UK and the Tax Justice Network have released statements pointing out that while the Grosvenors maneuver is entirely legal, it exploits loopholes in the UK's inheritance tax framework, loopholes that they claim entrench wealth in the hands of a small elite. Reform advocates emphasize that even families with estates worth just a fraction of the Grosvenors' holdings often end up paying far more in relative terms, deepening concerns about fairness and socioeconomic inequality. Regular op-eds in The Independent and New Statesman have amplified calls for a comprehensive review of trust and estate laws, contending that it is anachronistic for such large fortunes to be passed down with minimal tax burdens in a modern democratic society. Defenders of the current system, including representatives for the Grosvenor Group, say the family abides by all relevant UK tax laws and has a long-standing tradition of contributing to the public good. They argue that the origin of trust structures in England dates back centuries. Entailing estates was a way to ensure large properties were not automatically broken up upon the owner's death. Historically, this practice preserved the economic viability of estates that provided local employment, agriculture, and infrastructure. Spokespeople for the Grosvenors also highlight the family's philanthropic efforts through the Westminster Foundation, noting that significant sums are channeled into education, health care, and local community projects within the UK and abroad. The family emphasizes that if critics wish to change the inheritance tax system, the onus lies on Parliament to modify the laws rather than on individual families to volunteer for higher tax rates. However, controversy continues to simmer, fueled by a growing public focus on wealth inequality and by investigative reporting that examines how affluent families structure their finances. In the wake of the sixth Duke's death, tabloid outlets, investigative news sites such as Open Democracy, and more traditional newspapers revisited the Grosvenors' centuries-long practice of using legal mechanisms to safeguard their London real estate holdings in Mayfair and Belgravia. According to historians interviewed by the BBC, the practice of entailed or strict settlement estates can be traced back at least to the late 17th century, when certain noble families recognized that using trusts could help them avoid the forced sale of assets. Over time, these earlier entailed estates evolved into discretionary trusts, highly flexible arrangements that let trustees manage assets without the same public reporting obligations as typical companies or individuals. Critics argue that this adaptability now allows for complex, multi-layered structures that blur lines between asset preservation and tax avoidance, especially when the estates involved include billions of pounds in urban property. From a legal perspective, the trust mechanism is built on centuries of inheritance law shaped by aristocratic influence in Parliament. Trusts not only minimize estate taxes, but also often shield detailed records of property values, beneficiaries, and distribution schedules from public scrutiny. Private Eye magazine has occasionally run features examining the opacity of the Grosvenor trusts, suggesting that this secrecy limits public accountability, particularly around how large landholdings affect regional housing markets. Housing advocacy groups, including Shelter and Generation Rent, have noted that Mayfair and Belgravia's astronomical property values contribute to the broader London housing crisis, while the Grosvenors excel at maintaining and upgrading prime real estate. Skyrocketing rents in these districts exemplify the city's chronic affordability problems. Hugh Grosvenor's personal lifestyle adds another layer to the debate. Media profiles in the Telegraph, the Financial Times, and Tatler describe the seventh Duke as a low-key figure who keeps public appearances to a minimum, eschewing the flamboyant displays associated with some modern billionaires. Yet it is precisely this relative invisibility, coupled with reports of one of the largest inheritances in British history, that ignites online discussions about the transparency of ultra-wealthy families. A Financial Times feature from 2020 noted that while the Duke maintains a handful of prominent philanthropic commitments, including support for medical research and youth initiatives, details about his broader financial strategies remain either private or confined to official Grosvenor Group disclosures. In terms of legislative reform, ideas vary widely among policymakers, academics, and think tanks. Some recommend applying the standard inheritance tax at every generational transfer of trust-held assets rather than the 10-year periodic charge. Others suggest expanding public disclosure requirements, forcing large trusts above a certain threshold to file more detailed returns, or make basic asset valuations publicly available. Supporters of such measures argue that greater transparency would not only curb potential abuse, but also better inform debates about the impact of monumental landholdings on local economies. Meanwhile, opponents argue that abrupt changes could destabilize heritage estates and reduce the long-term investment needed to maintain historically significant properties, which often have extensive upkeep costs. They also warn of unintended consequences, such as land fragmentation or decreased willingness among wealthy individuals to invest in UK markets. According to the Grosvenor Group Annual Review, these investments contribute to the modernization of central urban districts, theoretically providing jobs and revitalizing older neighborhoods. Another point the Grosvenors highlight is the family's historical tradition of public service. Previous Dukes of Westminster often held high-ranking military positions or engaged in philanthropy to support veterans. Archival records at the Imperial War Museum detail how the first Duke made significant contributions during World War I, while the second and third Dukes were also known for their roles in supporting war relief efforts. Advocates for the family argue that these generational commitments reflect a deeper social responsibility, a claim sometimes parried by critics who see philanthropic pursuits as insufficiently compensating for the vast wealth shielded from higher taxation. Gerald Cavendish Grosvenor, the sixth Duke of Westminster, experienced a very public reckoning with his mental health when he suffered a nervous breakdown in 1998, an admission that at the time was exceptional for a member of the British aristocracy. The pressures he cited included not only his official responsibilities tied to the Grosvenor Group, one of the largest private property management and development companies in the world, but also the personal weight of representing and overseeing a centuries-old ducal estate. In an interview with Tatler, he confessed to having fallen into what he called a black hole, describing episodes of chronic depression so severe that they disrupted both his personal life and his ability to manage business affairs. Newspapers like The Guardian and The Telegraph, which covered the Duke's breakdown, noted that his candor contrasted starkly with the traditional reserve expected of high-ranking aristocrats. Historically, mental health struggles among Britain's nobility were often hidden behind a facade of discretion and understated protocol. The Duke's choice to speak openly about his battle with depression struck many observers as groundbreaking, illustrating the intense modern-day demands that can accompany inherited titles, large estates, and public roles. At the time of his breakdown, the Duke was already recognized for his substantial landholdings, centered around the Grosvenor estate, which includes prime real estate in Mayfair and Belgravia, and for various ceremonial functions. He stated that the combined stresses of estate administration, public duties, such as serving as a deputy lieutenant of Cheshire, and social obligations were pivotal factors contributing to his mental collapse. According to some local press coverage in Chester, near the Duke's Eaton Hall residence, courtiers and staff at the estate witnessed a marked shift in his demeanor during the lead-up to his breakdown, which eventually prompted him to seek medical intervention and therapy. Following this period, the Duke took steps to reduce the intensity of his day-to-day engagements. He made use of video conferencing technology at Eaton Hall, an idea that, according to certain interviews, allowed him to remain in contact with key business associates without the relentless travel schedule that previously characterized his role. This approach was significant at a time when remote conferencing was not yet ubiquitous, demonstrating the Duke's willingness to adopt newer methods to protect his well-being. In the wake of his breakdown, Gerald Grosvenor began scaling back certain responsibilities within the Grosvenor Group. While he remained the chairman, he delegated more operational tasks to professional executives, a transition that was noted in financial and property industry publications, such as Estates Gazette. These changes helped him maintain oversight of the empire, while ensuring that day-to-day pressure was spread among a broader leadership team. Sources from local Cheshire media described a calmer environment at Eaton Hall, with staff noting that the Duke's renewed emphasis on mental health extended to fostering a more supportive workplace culture. Parallel to his shift in personal responsibilities, the Duke also accelerated his family's philanthropic engagement. One of the most notable endeavors was his contribution to the establishment of the Defense and National Rehabilitation Center located near Loughborough. In 2014, multiple news outlets, including the BBC and The Independent, reported on his £105 million donation, which underwrote a major part of the facility. The DNRC was designed to provide world-class rehabilitation for members of the armed forces who had suffered significant injuries, a cause resonant with the Duke's own military background as a former territorial army officer. Some commentators, including journalists writing for The Times, suggested that the Duke's decision to invest heavily in rehabilitation services reflected lessons gleaned from his own struggles, underscoring a belief in specialized support for recovery. Further philanthropic efforts extended beyond the DNRC. He supported numerous charities related to mental health and community welfare in Cheshire and across the UK. Press releases archived on the Westminster Foundation's website describe an evolving grant portfolio focusing on education, community building, and health services. Local organizations, ranging from youth clubs in rural villages to hospital partnerships, benefited from the Duke's contributions, a portion of which might be interpreted as a response to the vulnerabilities he had experienced personally. Beyond the direct philanthropic channel, public opinion of the Duke's candid admission was largely sympathetic, marking a pivotal moment in changing attitudes toward mental health in elite circles. Opinion pieces in papers like The Telegraph hailed his openness as an example that even those with immense privilege can be susceptible to emotional strain and breakdown. Mental health advocates pointed to his interviews as encouraging figures of stature to express vulnerability, thereby reducing stigma in broader society. In turn, some historians of the aristocracy, writing in academic journals and on blogs devoted to British peerage, noted that Gerald's public statements offered a rare real-time view into the private burdens placed on heirs responsible for massive landholdings and long-standing family legacies. The Duke's journey toward stabilizing his mental health served as a reminder that dynastic responsibilities, often romanticized by the press and public, carry a reality of day-to-day pressures. Even as the Grosvenor Empire thrived, branching into new real estate markets worldwide, Gerald Grosvenor's decision to step back from certain direct managerial duties underscored how a family's centuries-old heritage can weigh heavily on a single individual. His story also highlighted the gradual cultural shift within the British aristocracy, where, by the early 21st century, open discussions of mental health had become slightly less taboo than they were in earlier decades. Gerald Grosvenor remained the Duke of Westminster until his death in 2016, and in retrospectives published shortly thereafter, his nervous breakdown in 1998 was often cited as a turning point that led him to prioritize well-being alongside wealth stewardship. The philanthropic legacy he left, embodied in large-scale charitable contributions like the DNRC, as well as local outreach in communities connected to his estate, may well stand as a reflection of the lessons learned from that dark period. Scholars of modern British aristocracy continue to view the Duke's candid interviews and public acknowledgement of chronic depression as a landmark for transparency, marking a moment when the private strains of noble life briefly came into sharp focus for the wider world. Hugh Richard Louis Grosvenor, the seventh Duke of Westminster, vaulted into public consciousness when he inherited an estimated £9 billion from his father, Gerald Grosvenor, in 2016, suddenly ranking among the world's youngest billionaires. Overnight, his name appeared in headlines worldwide, from the BBC to the New York Times, emphasizing not only the staggering scale of his inheritance, but also the enduring prominence of the Grosvenor family, whose storied lineage and property holdings date back to the 17th century. Despite this immense wealth, Hugh has consistently projected a subdued public persona that stands apart from the archetype of the free-spending, high-profile heir. The Grosvenors' real estate empire is almost legendary in Britain, encompassing much of London's upscale Mayfair and Belgravia districts, two of the most expensive residential areas on the planet, and branching into diverse global investments through the Grosvenor Group. Regularly featured in the Sunday Times Rich list as one of the UK's wealthiest individuals, Hugh could, if he wished, embrace a conspicuously luxurious lifestyle. Yet various media outlets, including Tatler and The Telegraph, portray him as notably modest, especially for someone tasked with overseeing a billion-pound fortune. Central to this quieter approach is the time Hugh spent working at BioBean, a green energy startup that converts used coffee grounds into biofuels. Reports in the Times detail how colleagues saw his involvement not as a trivial pastime, but as a real bid to explore sustainable business ventures. While the Grosvenor Group itself has a global portfolio, Hugh's choice to invest his time in a niche environmental enterprise underscores his interest in practical solutions to climate challenges, something not typically associated with an aristocrat born into vast wealth. Friends quoted in local Cheshire publications note that he found BioBean's focus on innovative recycling compelling, suggesting a genuine draw to stewardship beyond the conventional responsibilities of his title. Even social events reflect his understated style. Eaton Hall, the family seat in Cheshire, has historically hosted large gatherings and grand entertainments. Previous generations of the Grosvenors sometimes made headlines with lavish balls or philanthropic galas. In Hugh's hands, however, the estate's gatherings appear comparatively subdued. Musician Jordan Stevens, who performed at Hugh's 21st birthday party, went on record in an interview describing the occasion as unexpectedly low-key, given the setting and the guest list, highlighting the Duke's deliberate desire to avoid excess. This stance came as a surprise to observers who had anticipated a royal-scale celebration. Yet it aligns neatly with Hugh's broader reputation for preferring privacy over pageantry. His personal connections further heightened scrutiny. Named a godfather to Prince George, an announcement that circulated widely in the BBC and in Royal Watcher blogs, Hugh holds a symbolic link to the British royal family. Yet he has shown no inclination to exploit this relationship for media attention, rarely discussing his royal connections in public. Instead, coverage in outlets like the Evening Standard notes that he focuses on running the Grosvenor estate, liaising with managers, examining investment opportunities, and ensuring the family's extensive portfolio aligns with long-term goals. Associates mentioned in these reports characterize him as hands-on, especially concerning philanthropic commitments, which gained fresh attention during the COVID-19 crisis. His multi-million-pound donations, reported at various times as reaching £10 to £12.5 million, to bolster Britain's National Health Service placed him in the national spotlight. But the manner in which he disclosed this contribution was telling. A handful of concise press statements and a few charitable acknowledgments sufficed, rather than any glitzy public event. Commentators, including journalists for The Guardian, praised the donation while also noting the Duke's refusal to engage in the kind of publicity that might accompany lesser gifts from other donors. On social media outlets, including X, formerly Twitter, reactions have ranged from admiration, citing his readiness to assist in a public health emergency, to cynicism, suggesting a carefully managed public relations strategy designed to forestall critique about the vast inequality of wealth. Such debate reflects a broader tension. In a world increasingly concerned with economic disparity, high net worth individuals often face pressure to demonstrate social responsibility. The Grosvenor family's philanthropic history stretches back generations, funding projects in healthcare, education, and local community initiatives. However, the glare of modern social media can easily recast quiet donations and community support as either altruism or self-interest. Detractors point to meticulously cultivated press releases, while supporters highlight consistent charitable giving over the years. Regardless, insider accounts, occasionally shared through interviews and broadsheets like The Times, suggest that Hugh genuinely prefers a normal life, insofar as that is possible for someone overseeing one of Europe's largest private real estate fortunes. More than one commentator has noted the parallels between Hugh's approach and that of his late father, Gerald Grosvenor, who famously wrestled with the personal pressures of inheriting and managing the Grosvenor legacy. Indeed, Gerald's experiences might have informed Hugh's method of balancing duty with privacy. Observers who have studied the family, such as bloggers focusing on British aristocracy or reporters with a long history of covering the peerage, often remark that Hugh's moderated style echoes a centuries-old playbook: remain discreet, maintain philanthropic ties, and minimize public extravagance. Still, critics can't help but point out that any low-profile approach coexists with extraordinary privilege. The mere fact that the Duke's holdings comprise prime swaths of London's real estate underscores the scale of his power, no matter how quietly that power is exercised. Some social media posts argue that the Duke's moderate public image conveniently deflects the intensifying criticism around wealth inequality, urging skeptics to peer behind the curtain at the Grosvenor Group's significant influence in global property markets. Yet repeated reviews in financial and property publications confirm that the Duke has, to date, avoided letting personal flamboyance overshadow broader business strategy, preferring a corporate structure replete with professional managers rather than operating as a singular, omnipresent figurehead. For many, Hugh Grosvenor's lifestyle epitomizes a fresh version of aristocratic modernity, an acceptance of old responsibilities blended with new era corporate norms, and philanthropic emphasis. His presence at Eaton Hall remains deeply tied to tradition, but his forays into innovative, eco-friendly startups and willingness to quietly channel wealth toward public causes illustrate a redefinition of what it means to be an aristocratic heir in the 21st century. Whether a carefully orchestrated PR strategy or a sincere expression of personal values, the result is the same. He stands out ironically for an absence of ostentation. In a lineage often synonymous with grandeur, the seventh Duke's understated public life challenges both longtime observers and casual onlookers to rethink assumptions about how power and privilege should manifest in modern aristocracy. Hugh Richard Arthur Grosvenor, 2nd Duke of Westminster, 1879 to 1953, better known by his nickname Bendor, came of age during the waning days of Victorian Britain, only to make his mark in the heady, turbulent decades that followed. Media outlets of the early 20th century, ranging from the Times to London's prolific tabloid press, frequently featured him, though not always in a flattering light. High society gossip columns marveled at his personal extravagance, his rotating cast of lovers, and his unapologetically outspoken nature. The archives of British newspapers attest to a man who, by virtue of title and inheritance, could have led a stately, conventional, aristocratic life, but instead chose to write his own script, often in ways that left observers divided between admiration and scorn. While many aristocrats of his era enjoyed discreet affairs or arranged marriages, Bendor's relationships were marked by a distinctive flair for the dramatic. His decade-long entanglement with Coco Chanel remains the most famous instance, in part because Chanel herself was a towering figure in fashion and cultural history. Their partnership reportedly began in the mid-1920s, and as biographers like Axel Madsen and Lisa Cheney note, the two seemed fascinated by each other's sense of style, independence, and celebrity. The Duke lavished Chanel with gifts, from a London townhouse rumored to be deeded under a confidant's name to the now legendary Riviera Villa, which chroniclers claim was designed to serve as a sanctuary for their private liaisons. Contemporary letters and diaries, some featured in exhibitions at fashion museums, offer glimpses of a lively, if fraught, romance. Chanel's ascendancy in the fashion world afforded her an elite social network, while Bendor's aristocratic standing and immense resources provided an aura of regality around their gatherings. Stories of hidden jewels allegedly smuggled under cover of vegetable crates or passed off as mundane flower deliveries circulated in dinner parties from Paris to London. Although the documentation for these anecdotes tends to be anecdotal, reflecting the secretive nature of their arrangement, such tales were catnip for society reporters. The Daily Mail, for instance, occasionally dropped veiled hints about mysterious shipments, supposedly bound for Chanel, feeding a public appetite for salacious rumor. While it's near impossible to verify the more outrageous claims, the mystique built around Bendor and Coco's relationship only grew with each new whisper. Yet the Duke's romance with Chanel, spectacular as it was, pales in comparison to the darker chapter of his political leanings. Even before Hitler rose to power, segments of Britain's upper crust had flirted with fascistic and anti-Semitic notions, an unsettling trend chronicled by historians such as Martin Pugh and Richard Griffiths. According to references in works like Pugh's Hurrah for the Black Shirts, Fascists and Fascism in Britain. Between the wars, Bendor was part of an aristocratic milieu that admired Germany's perceived economic revival in the 1930s. He apparently attended gatherings where Hitler's name was evoked in admiring tones, and in some cases penned letters reflecting anti-Semitic sentiments. Newspapers of the time did not always report on these views. There was a certain reticence among mainstream outlets to detail unsavory opinions held by nobles, but private correspondences, occasionally cited in specialized monographs, revealed that his sympathies went beyond idle dinner table talk. One factor that magnified the significance of Bendor's stance was the sheer influence he wielded. The Grosvenor fortune, entrenched in prime London real estate and diversified investments, gave him a social cachet that could sway or at least embolden like-minded peers. Some historians who have examined aristocratic circles in the interwar period highlight Bendor's connections to key political figures, both in Britain and continental Europe. Records from occasional visits to Germany, as well as references in diaries belonging to other nobility, imply that he rubbed shoulders with prominent German aristocrats who themselves were grappling with their relationships to the Nazi regime. While Bendor never publicly joined the British Union of Fascists, led by Sir Oswald Mosley, his documented expression of admiration for Nazi successes fit into a broader pattern of upper-class flirtation with far-right ideologies. Complicating matters is Coco Chanel's own tangled wartime history. In Hal Vaughn's Sleeping with the Enemy, Coco Chanel's Secret War, the designer's relationship with Nazi officials during the occupation of Paris is scrutinized. While the extent of her collaboration or complicity remains debated, some argue she was primarily motivated by a desire to protect her business interests. Speculative posts on X, formerly Twitter, have attempted to draw a direct line between Chanel's alleged collusion and Bendor's known pro-German sentiments. Mainstream historians largely view these claims as circumstantial. Still, they underscore how the Duke's controversial worldview continues to spark conjecture about the company he kept and the influence he may have exerted on those around him. Although Bendor's pro-Nazi stance did not lead to formal censure or any direct role in wartime politics, it left an indelible mark on his personal legacy. By the post-war years, when the scale of Nazi atrocities became widely understood, the British press occasionally invoked his name as an example of upper-class naivete. Or worse, reports resurfaced referencing statements he had made that, in light of the war's outcome, appeared not just misguided, but morally reprehensible. Some of his contemporaries in the peerage, including those who had flirted with far-right beliefs, tried to distance themselves, and the Grosvenor family itself soon refocused on charitable endeavors and property management to overshadow the scandal. But it proved difficult to wholly erase the memory of the second Duke's vociferous praise for a regime that would, within years, commit vast atrocities across Europe. Modern discussions about Bendor tend to revolve around two poles: the sensationalism of his personal life, the Chanel affair, his flamboyant spending, and rumored smuggling of jewels, and the disquieting reality of his political sympathies. British history documentaries examining the lead-up to World War II frequently mention him alongside other aristocrats, such as the Mitford sisters, some of whom were also Nazi sympathizers, to illustrate the ideological confusion of the period. Academic blogs devoted to the study of pre-war aristocratic circles cite his story as evidence that wealth, privilege, and anti-democratic ideologies were not mutually exclusive. Meanwhile, fashion historians revisiting Coco Chanel's story find themselves unable to ignore the complexities of her ties to powerful men like Bendor, whose influence extended beyond mere social glitter. For the Grosvenor family, Bendor's era represents a decidedly checkered chapter, one that contrasts sharply with later Dukes' philanthropic works and attempts at cultivating a more progressive image. If, on one hand, Bendor serves as a colorful historical figure whose exploits enthrall with their extravagance, on the other, he is a stark reminder that aristocratic glamour can at times mask toxic or destructive beliefs. The tension between these two narratives helps explain why, decades after his death, the second Duke still looms large in popular and scholarly memory, simultaneously fascinating the public and troubling those who examine how power and privilege can intersect with dark ideological currents. You know how some places in a big city give off an aura of old-world elegance, almost as if you've stepped into a historical painting? Picture London's Mayfair and Belgravia, those ultra-exclusive neighborhoods that instantly bring to mind images of stately white townhouses, classic black railings, and immaculate squares lined with leafy trees. Now imagine that 300 years ago, those very spots were basically soggy marshland, written off by many as unfit for decent living. This remarkable turnaround, transforming a swampy backwater into some of the most coveted addresses on the planet, can be traced to the Grosvenor family, whose centuries-old marriage arrangement set the stage for a dynasty that would shape the skyline and social fabric of modern London. It's a story filled with forward-thinking real estate strategies, a bit of controversy over inherited privilege, and a staggering amount of wealth built on land that was once considered, in the words of some 17th century pamphlets, a place you'd want to avoid if you valued your health. Back in 1677, Sir Thomas Grosvenor, the third baronet, married Mary Davies, who owned around 500 acres of land to the west of London's then urban center. Although 500 acres might sound impressive, many people at the time wouldn't have looked at this marshy terrain with admiration. It was described in diaries as waterlogged, disease-prone, and generally unpleasant. Some local historians, referencing archival commentary from that era, note that livestock farmers preferred more stable ground elsewhere, and city dwellers found the smell and dampness off-putting. Flooding was routine, drainage was limited, and it took a brave soul indeed to envision a grand urban future for this patch of soggy real estate. Yet from the vantage point of the modern day, where Mayfair and Belgravia rank among the most expensive squares of land in the entire world, it's clear that the Grosvenors either saw an opportunity or simply got lucky. According to a Sky News analysis, if they had sold that land piece by piece in the 18th century, the family's fortunes might have dissipated long ago. Instead, they developed it, shaped it, and rented it out, a decision that laid the groundwork for tremendous generational wealth. The real push to build started in the early 1700s. By that point, London was expanding beyond the old city walls, and the newly affluent classes, drawn from both aristocracy and successful mercantile families, wanted more spacious, fashionable quarters. Enter Mayfair, which began taking shape around the 1720s. Imagine the cramped, soot-stained buildings of central London back then. Even with their grandeur, they lacked fresh air and felt claustrophobic. Mayfair offered room to breathe. The squares and crescents that popped up catered to an emerging aristocratic clientele, with broad streets and elegant facades that set them apart from the older parts of the city. Local newspapers of the period, according to archives in the British Library, sometimes published breathless updates about new squares under construction. People were curious, almost skeptical, about whether these developments would attract stable, long-term residents or turn into vanity projects. But over time, families with titles and substantial fortunes made their move. The area's developer-friendly environment, coupled with the Grosvenors' willingness to lease plots for housing, proved a winning formula. That success story extended further south when, in the 19th century, attention turned to a swath of land that would become Belgravia. This district is closely associated with the architectural vision of Thomas Cubitt, whose refined neoclassical designs were widely praised in periodicals like The Builder and the Illustrated London News. Cubitt's approach emphasized geometric street layouts, uniform facades, and stately terraces built around garden squares. If you've ever strolled through Belgrave Square or Eaton Square, you've likely been struck by the sense of calm grandeur, white stucco exteriors glowing in the rare London sunshine, black railings framing basement entrances, and the hush that comes from having private gardens just steps away from bustling thoroughfares. Contemporary commentators, including none other than Edgar Allan Poe, marveled that this once barren, fetid waste had been reimagined as a haven of aristocratic refinement. Newspapers from the 1820s and 1830s carried stories about the skyrocketing rental prices in newly built terraces, a sure sign that Belgravia was on its way to becoming a top-tier address. One of the master strokes that secured the Grosvenor family's enduring prosperity, and you still see its impact today, was their choice to operate under a leasehold model rather than selling land outright. In plain language, it meant that while others could build grand houses, run shops, or open exclusive clubs, the freehold ownership stayed firmly with the Grosvenors. This system involved long leases, often set at 99 years, letting tenants invest in developing and improving the property, all while paying a steady ground rent back to the estate. Historians who study London's great estates, the Portman, the Bedford, the Cadogan, and of course the Grosvenor, highlight that by maintaining the freehold, these families could periodically renegotiate terms, adjust ground rents, and collect what effectively amounted to a perpetual income stream. According to real estate historians writing in the London Journal, this decision proved critical. It kept the estate's wealth compounding with each successive generation, preventing the kind of one-time land sell-off that might have left the family reliant on old money that could dwindle over time. Instead, the estate adapted to each new era, Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, and onward, by reevaluating leases, sanctioning redevelopment, and carefully controlling the area's visual and cultural identity. By the Victorian era, Mayfair and Belgravia were nearly synonymous with the idea of top-drawer living. Park Lane, hugging Hyde Park, began to attract more and more aristocratic residences, while newly founded clubs in St. James's offered exclusive retreats for the wealthy to socialize. Reporters covering society events described carriages lined up outside grand townhouses, and the social columns were filled with updates on lavish dinners or seasonal balls. Auction records from the 19th century, preserved in local archives, show properties selling for sums that dwarfed comparable listings in many other parts of London. Over and over, we see references to the role of the Grosvenor estate in enforcing building standards, preserving aesthetic harmony, and ensuring that the area didn't descend into the overbuilt chaos that plagued less regulated parts of the city. This kind of meticulous urban planning made these neighborhoods all the more attractive to those who could afford them. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Mayfair and Belgravia remain among the most eye-wateringly expensive districts on the planet. Real estate listings commonly showcase luxury apartments, revamped Georgian houses, and modern penthouses fitted with the latest technology. Prices can run into tens of millions of pounds per property. The Guardian, commenting on these astronomical figures, notes that an international influx, think wealthy buyers from the Middle East, Russia, Asia, has driven up demand even further. The area's brand recognition is so strong that a Mayfair address has become shorthand worldwide for premium real estate. Articles in the Times occasionally highlight how certain squares attract new development projects, maybe a historic building refurbished into high-end condos, while still operating under the watchful eye of the Grosvenor estate's managers, who set guidelines to keep everything in line with the district's storied identity. But with big money and centuries-long aristocratic heritage comes scrutiny. On social media, especially X, formerly Twitter, a vocal contingent of critics questions the morality of a single family, descendants of a 17th century marital arrangement, reaping immense profits on land they never relinquished. They point to issues like housing affordability in London, saying that the high rents in Belgravia and Mayfair deepen inequalities. The Financial Times has published editorials that echo these sentiments, arguing that while private estates do maintain architectural heritage, they also contribute to a property market increasingly out of reach for ordinary Londoners. The Independent has run features on how young professionals struggle to find housing anywhere near these neighborhoods, effectively turning them into enclaves for foreign investors and the super rich. Defenders of the Grosvenor estate, however, push back. They note that the family historically has poured resources into civic improvements, from beautifying squares to maintaining public gardens, sometimes even providing charitable support to local institutions. According to occasional press releases from the estate itself, various restoration projects for listed buildings have been funded to ensure they remain historically accurate. Some local business owners report that the estate managers are relatively supportive of curated retail development, aiming for a mix of high-end boutiques and small, specialized shops. Whether these efforts truly balance out the critical concerns about land ownership remains an open question, but it does suggest a more complex picture than simply family profits, city suffers. Looking at the big picture, the Grosvenors exemplify how certain aristocratic fortunes still have a tangible impact on modern urban life. Historians like David Kinniston, who've studied London's evolution, remark that Mayfair and Belgravia's character is inseparable from the estate's approach to land management, a blend of commercial savvy, aesthetic oversight, and a reluctance to relinquish freehold rights. You can walk down a quiet street near Eaton Square and pass uniformed terraces dating back nearly 2 centuries, each meticulously preserved yet adapted for 21st century living, complete with security cameras and basement gyms. This sense of timelessness, critics argue, is also part of the problem. It's a near-feudal continuity that leaves little room for more democratic input on how the space should be used. Step right into a world where ancient customs still shape modern fortunes, and discover why a centuries-old inheritance rule can stir so much debate in the 21st century. The focus here is on the Grosvenor family, owners of vast property portfolios in London's Mayfair and Belgravia, who uphold the practice of primogeniture, a tradition that hands the bulk of a family's titles and assets to the firstborn son born. Although Britain's royal family has ended male preference primogeniture for the crown, the Grosvenors remain bound by it, creating a stir among observers who find the custom anachronistic, to quote articles in The Guardian and The Times. Critics argue it belongs to a bygone era, yet defenders insist that this age-old principle keeps historic estates intact. The result is a vivid clash between tradition and modern notions of equality. When Gerald Grosvenor, the sixth Duke of Westminster, passed away in 2016, he left behind an estimated £9 billion fortune. Despite having two older sisters, Lady Tamara van Cutsum and Lady Edwina Snow, née Grosvenor, his only son, Hugh Grosvenor, became the seventh Duke of Westminster and inherited the vast majority of the wealth. Multiple mainstream outlets, including The Guardian, noted that this handover of power was completely legal, but raised eyebrows because Britain had partially dismantled male preference primogeniture for the monarchy via the Succession to the Crown Act, 2013, legislation that itself was spurred by the 2011 Perth Agreement and took effect in 2015, once it was ratified by all relevant realms. This act ended the centuries-old rule that would favor a younger brother over an older sister for the throne, reflecting a broader move toward gender equality within the monarchy. Meanwhile, aristocratic titles such as the Duke of Westminster remain untouched by that reform, leaving families like the Grosvenors to navigate a separate set of inheritance customs. Under the Grosvenors' current inheritance framework, the title and principal estates default to the firstborn son, while daughters receive secondary provisions, perhaps through trust funds or smaller property holdings. This approach is meant to preserve the integrity of estates like Eaton Hall, which has served as the family seat for generations. Property law experts quoted in the Times and the Independent emphasize that these customs are deeply rooted in centuries-old aristocratic aims to ensure large tracts of land stay united under one heir. In this view, if ownership were divided equally among siblings, it could splinter these ancestral holdings, diminish their long-term economic viability, and weaken the philanthropic networks tied to them. Not everyone views it that way. The Guardian has labeled this arrangement outdated, pointing out that if the monarchy itself can move toward gender neutrality and succession, there may be little excuse for aristocratic families not to do the same. Advocacy groups like Daughters' Rights have publicly condemned male preference primogeniture as institutionalized discrimination, particularly when fortunes run into the billions. Posts on social media platforms, including X, formerly Twitter, echo these sentiments, demanding reform to align the peerage with modern equality standards. The New Statesman has also published commentary suggesting that the aristocracy should not remain immune to gender equality principles that have reshaped everything from corporate governance to public office. Leading up to Hugh Grosvenor's succession, debate around the system intensified. Some critics used examples from the monarchy to say that if a future princess can become queen ahead of a younger brother, then the daughters of a duke should similarly inherit the dukedom. More traditional voices, however, caution that reforming primogeniture within the peerage would unleash a wave of inheritance disputes, especially when old entailing mechanisms, legal structures that keep estates in specific family lines, might need rewriting. Publications like Country Life and History Today have analyzed how primogeniture, while seemingly unjust, historically helped aristocratic families stay financially stable. Entailed estates could fund village developments, local churches, and charitable projects, granting a measure of continuity that some argue benefits the broader community. A shift in the inheritance model, they warn, could prompt forced sales or deep legal wrangling over who inherits what. In the Grosvenor family, the story is further enriched by the personalities involved. Gerald Grosvenor, the sixth Duke, had a public service background, including military roles. He was known for his philanthropic commitments, donating millions to various causes and supporting charitable ventures tied to veterans' rehabilitation. His son Hugh, upon inheriting the title of 7th Duke of Westminster, remained relatively discreet in media appearances. Profiles in the Financial Times and the Sunday Times indicate he is aware of the changing social context, but has not openly stated whether he believes primogeniture should be reformed. Reporters note that whenever he's asked, he tends to offer careful replies, keeping the focus on charitable activities or day-to-day management of the Grosvenor Group's vast real estate portfolio. This approach contrasts with the 7th Duke's older sisters, who do not bear a formal aristocratic title, yet have significant personal influence through their philanthropic work. Lady Tamara, the eldest sibling, is married to Edward Van Cutsem, whose family has long-standing links with the British royal family, links that get mentioned in outlets like Tatler, which often covers high society weddings and philanthropic receptions. Lady Edwina, for her part, is married to the historian and broadcaster Dan Snow. She has garnered media attention for her commitment to prison reform. The Guardian and BBC News have both covered her charitable endeavors, such as co-founding The Clink, a chain of in-prison restaurants that provide culinary training and job skills to inmates. She has also been involved in One Small Thing, an initiative promoting trauma-informed practices in women's prisons, as detailed by charities that focus on rehabilitation programs. Both sisters have impressive philanthropic portfolios, reflecting the family's broader tradition of charitable engagement. Yet neither wields the same rank, estate control, or financial clout that comes with being the 7th Duke. Observers often point out that this disparity underscores the real-world impact of primogeniture. Lady Tamara and Lady Edwina may enjoy comfortable wealth, but their brother presides over a multi-billion-pound empire and holds a dukedom recognized by the British peerage. Some critics note the contrasting precedent set by Princess Anne, who famously missed out on any chance to inherit the crown simply because she had younger brothers. The monarchy's reforms finally address such scenarios, yet those reforms do not extend to ducal families. Unsurprisingly, the Grosvenors' approach has become a high-profile symbol of an aristocratic tradition that stands firm against changing cultural values. Supporters of primogeniture argue that continuity is essential, especially when estates have philanthropic commitments and historical obligations. Eaton Hall, for instance, is not just the Grosvenor family residence. It hosts charitable events and local fundraisers, and it coordinates community outreach programs that rely on unified ownership. The same applies to property in Mayfair and Belgravia, where prime real estate rentals help fund local community improvements and cultural initiatives. The Grosvenors point out that subdividing these holdings among multiple heirs could result in fragmented management, weaker planning, and a decline in the estate's capacity to support philanthropic projects. Legal experts who have commented in The Independent emphasize that while this logic seems retrograde, it does preserve a style of benevolent feudalism, which can have positive knock-on effects for the local population, provided the estate's owners commit to meaningful social investment. Opponents remain unconvinced. They argue that historically stable estates do not necessarily guarantee progressive social outcomes. In an era of skyrocketing property prices, especially in areas like Mayfair and Belgravia, many community advocates claim that large aristocratic landholders can contribute to the housing crisis by keeping rents high and controlling significant tracts of city property. A broadening of inheritance could, in their view, break up these monopolies, potentially creating more diversified development in the heart of London. As more families like the Grosvenors face public scrutiny, calls to reevaluate aristocratic inheritance customs intensify, with some in Parliament suggesting incremental changes. Still, any major overhaul would require new legislation, and as The Guardian has repeatedly pointed out, the political will to tackle aristocratic privilege is often lukewarm. For the Grosvenors themselves, primogeniture remains a personal matter, carrying centuries of legacy and family identity. Although they seldom speak in detail about it, glimpses of their family dynamics surface during events and charitable galas. The sisters and the seventh Duke frequently appear together at philanthropic gatherings, projecting unity despite the underlying tension that some observers suspect might lurk behind the scenes. Publications like Tatler and The Telegraph have hinted that if there are any family disputes about inheritance rules, they stay firmly off record. Publicly, the sisters have expressed support for each other's projects, Lady Edwina's prison reform initiatives, Lady Tamara's charitable engagements, and the Duke's real estate management. Whether or not they believe the system is fair is left largely unspoken. Part of what makes the Grosvenor example so compelling is that it ties directly into broader questions of wealth and social justice. In recent years, the UK has seen fierce debates over housing shortages, and critics often point out the role that massive inherited estates can play in driving up property prices. Advocacy groups concerned with urban development argue that families like the Grosvenors possess disproportionate control over key London districts, limiting new housing stock or setting rents that only the super rich can afford. Defenders of the estate maintain that they have spearheaded socially conscious projects and keep many properties at market rates, injecting funds back into local improvements. Nonetheless, the conversation about whether primogeniture perpetuates inequality by concentrating resources in the hands of one chosen heir only grows louder. The seventh Duke's stance has been to keep public focus on charitable endeavors and the family's commitment to managing valuable real estate responsibly. When asked about primogeniture, he typically deflects toward discussing the positive impact the Grosvenor Group aims to have in areas like sustainable urban design, community building, and philanthropic outreach. This approach mirrors the modern aristocrats' balancing act, bridging a centuries-old system with progressive-sounding initiatives that resonate with current social values. Indeed, the Grosvenor Group has released various annual reviews emphasizing sustainable redevelopment in its global real estate holdings, including projects in Vancouver, Hong Kong, and San Francisco. Yet for all these efforts, no large-scale plan has emerged to alter the family's traditional inheritance patterns. In the end, the Grosvenor sisters' lesser inheritance and the seventh Duke's silence on the matter encapsulate a broader social crossroads: respect for tradition and estate continuity versus the modern drive for equality and fairness. As the legal and cultural landscapes shift, and as younger generations of aristocrats encounter a world radically different from the one their ancestors knew, primogeniture could eventually face renewed legal challenges or even legislative change. Until then, the Grosvenors stand as a living example of how a storied family can embrace contemporary philanthropic values while still preserving a rule that places one male heir in charge of a massive fortune. Whether that contradiction is justifiable, inevitable, or overdue for reform remains a matter of passionate debate, one likely to intensify each time another heir steps forward to claim a centuries-old title and all the wealth that comes with it.